Today, I'll be ranking Persona 5 Royal Palaces from best to worst. Starting at number 1 is Maruki's Palace. Yep, this one is fantastic. The palace has amazing music, a really cool theme and aesthetic, as well as some decently challenging enemies later on, and then there's the boss fight. Although it's too easy in my opinion, everything else about the fight is perfect. Not only does it look great and have a fantastic soundtrack, but the mechanics are interesting and it really feels like a final boss. The stakes and weight of the ending really finish off Persona 5 in a meaningful and engaging way. The combination of emotional cutscenes and dialogue make it all even more significant in my mind. Overall, Maruki's Palace is definitely the best palace in Persona 5 Royal for me. Next, we have number 2, and it has to be the Depths of Mementos / the Real World, which I'll be counting as one palace since they're pretty short and have the same ruler. I love this palace for the music, the look and feel of each section, the enemies and the boss fights. Well, mostly the second Holy Grail and Yaldabaoth fights. In terms of music, I actually prefer Life Will Change to Maruki's Palace theme, Gentle Madman, but the Depths of Mementos theme is just a bit under Gentle Madman, meaning the palace themes even out for me in terms of quality. The look and feel of both the Depths of Mementos and the Real World are incredible to me. It's hard to explain, but the ominous atmosphere of the depths and the apocalyptic feel of the Real World really elevate this palace / palaces for me when it comes to quality. Plus, the music for each place fits really well in my opinion. Although the enemies are great in the Real World, being challenging and having multiple cool mini-bosses, the enemies in the Depths of Mementos leave a lot to be desired. They're just too weak to give any form of challenge, which kinda kills the fun of fighting them. So overall, the enemies balance out to being pretty good. As for the boss, the Holy Grail fight in the depths isn't that amazing because it's more of a plot device than a fight, but the second Holy Grail fight and the subsequent Yaldabaoth fight are awesome. The backdrops and the music, including both Rivers in the Desert and the Yaldabaoth theme, really emphasize the intensity of the fight. Difficulty-wise, the second fight hits the nail on the head. It's not too easy, but it isn't insanely hard either. With that said, I do have mixed feelings about winning the fight, then being forced to lose anyway so you can beat him in a cutscene, but even so, the finisher is nothing short of incredible as well. So why isn't this palace number 1? Well, Maruki's Palace beats it for a few reasons. A, even when combining the depths and the Real World, they're a bit too short by comparison. B, like I said, the enemies in the Depths of Mementos are just too weak for my tastes, whereas the enemies in Maruki's Palace get much stronger later on to make up for the easy waves earlier on. And C, as great as the look and theme of this palace are, how well the theme and look of Maruki's Palace fit together and how unique it is compared to previous palaces make Maruki's rank slightly higher than the Depths of Mementos and the Real World, although it is very close. Now on to palace number 3, and it has to be Size. This palace is a fan favorite. It consistently ranks as one of the best palaces in the polls I run on the channel, and I can totally see why. For starters, the music is excellent, which when combined with the casino aesthetic feels really fun and intriguing. And what adds on to the experience is the gameplay, in which the whole cheating motif is clearly present for the players to experience. The dice games are rigged, so you have to break into the back room and rig the games in your favor, and the slots are rigged too, so you have to find terminals and again change them. The House of Darkness, despite being somewhat annoying, fits this theme as well because the exit is locked, so you have to break out of it. And finally, the battle arena is not only an opportunity to show off your persona builds and badassery, but they immediately break the rules of a one-on-one battle by pinning you against several enemies at a time. What makes these segments great is that they don't just let you have fun or just reflect the palace rules distortion, but they do both at once. On top of that, the boss is really good. The whole roulette thing fits the fight extremely well and makes for an interesting gimmick. Plus, the idea of her resisting everything but the opposite of the element she uses is a cool concept in my eyes. My only real gripe with it is that the difficulty is entirely dependent on how quickly you figure her out. Doing this to some degree isn't an issue. Making the fight more manageable for players who are smart enough to pick up on things is good, but when the fight is a complete cakewalk once you know what element to attack her with, that's somewhat of a problem from my perspective. Still, on the whole, this fight is one of my favorites purely for the concepts and the cool factor. So with all that being said, why isn't Size Palace number 1 or even number 2? To summarize, epicness, for lack of a better word, is a huge bonus for a palace, and the Depths of Mementos in the Real World have much more of it than Size Palace. As for Maruki's, it might seem odd to call it epic considering the lab aesthetic and the pretty calming music, but you also have to consider the story significance of altering reality and the boss fight, which, despite being too easy, is super epic in every other way. Size boss is decently cool as well, but it's nowhere near the same level as the Maruki and Yaldabaoth boss fights. And my other issue with Size Palace is that it's too short. And yes, so is the Depths of Mementos / Real World Palace, but they have better music and they have more challenging enemies as well. And of course, Maruki's Palace is a fair bit longer than Size on top of having better music, which is how, in my mind, I justify placing it at number 3 on my list. Next up, at number 4, we have Shido's Palace. This one isn't game changing, but it is pretty cool. The music is not quite as good as that of the higher ranking palaces, but still really good. The aesthetic is great in my opinion, and the enemies have a good level of challenge. There's also a few puzzle-like segments where you have to alternate between moving forward normally and doing so as a rat, granting you access to areas you otherwise wouldn't be able to reach. I don't hate these segments. I don't think they're amazing, although I can't explain why beyond saying they don't feel awesome, but they're not that bad either. What really elevates this palace, apart from the enemies, is the boss, or rather, bosses. Shido's Palace doesn't just have a really good main boss in Shido, but an insanely epic additional boss in Akechi. Akechi's fight does suffer from being too easy in my opinion, but the cutscenes do an amazing job of building up to the fight and making the whole thing feel incredibly awesome. And Shido's fight is on a whole nother level. The build up is arguably a bit weaker than that of Akechi's fight, but the battle itself makes up for this and then some. The varying resistances in his first 3 phases make for an interesting start with a good degree of challenge. Then phase 4 amps up the difficulty and takes away his resistances, which I really like. Having Shido resist all magic or physical attacks for the whole fight would probably be really frustrating for some players, but having him resist them for only the beginning is a good middle ground that keeps things interesting but doesn't make the whole fight stupid. Like in phase 4, phase 5 amps things up even further, giving him even deadlier attacks and more health, and after that the 6th and final phase begins, forcing you to finish him off alone. This is a really nice touch and I think it's executed very well. This phase doesn't start until Shido gets really low on health, so it's not too drawn out or too difficult, but it still gives you a moment of fear and one final challenge before you win the fight. So this palace is pretty good all around. The only reason it doesn't rank higher is because it doesn't quite reach the heights of the other palaces' aesthetics, music, and atmosphere. Shido's palace does a few things really well, mainly the enemies and bosses, but the best features of the high rank palaces, the music and aesthetic of Sai's palace, the epicness of the depth/real world palace, and the uniqueness of Maruki's make them just a bit better. At number 5 we have Futaba's palace. This one isn't really ranked here because of any serious issues, it's more because the music, aesthetic, and enemies are all good, but not exactly game changing in any way. The music isn't quite as good as any of the higher rank palaces, and the same goes for the aesthetic and general feel, although the atmosphere is unique similarly to Maruki's palace because Futaba's not evil, but to a lesser degree. That being said, the enemies are definitely a highlight. The Anubis savage enemy and the unique Mott mini-boss who can turn a party member into a mouse are pretty challenging and I like that. The other enemies vary a bit in terms of difficulty, but overall they're pretty good. As for the boss, Cognitive Wakaba is actually a pretty good one in my opinion. The whole you can't use physical skills while she's in the air thing is a bit annoying if you focus too much on physical skills for Joker, but that seems like something you should be punished for in this game. Apart from that, using the ballista and getting to wail on her when she's down just feels really cool to me. Although I will say the low damage you do when she's in the air can make it feel pretty drawn out, but that's really the only issue I have with it. And some might dislike willpower playing instead of blooming villain for most of the fight, but I love both songs so it doesn't really bother me. All in all, Futaba's palace is quite good, it just doesn't do anything mind-blowing to reach the heights of some other palaces. Now for number 6 on the list, we have Kaneshiro's palace. First, I'll say this before the Persona community collectively burns me at the stake. Yes, the music is god tier. The only reason Price doesn't beat some other palace themes is because of personal preference as opposed to actual issues with the song, since I'm no music expert. That, and even though I'm glad there's 2 songs throughout the palace to prevent it from being too repetitive, I don't like the second version of Price that much. Moving on though, the aesthetic and atmosphere of Kaneshiro's palace are pretty good as well. I personally prefer that of the higher rank palaces, but Kaneshiro's is still in a good spot since infiltrating a bank as thieves is really cool. As for enemies, I'm about to say something very stupid, so bear with me. I don't remember much about this palace's enemies, apart from one savage enemy that's really tanky and does a lot of damage. Having mediocre enemies hurts the palace in my eyes because it doesn't lead to any lasting emotions. We all remember Okumura's palace because the majority of the community hates it, and on the flip side we all remember Maruki's palace and Sai's because they're so widely loved. The enemies and Kaneshiro's palace overall falls into this no man's land where I don't feel strongly either way, which can have an unfortunate effect of me brushing over some of the palace's positives. However, let me remind you that the reason this one is ranked at 6 isn't because it's bad, but more because others are just really good by comparison. And with that, we're at number 7, Kamoshida's palace. This one is overall just kinda average. There's nothing super horrible about it, but nothing amazing about it either. The enemies are okay, I guess. The savage enemy is pretty challenging and I like that, but the rest are just kind of there. The music is also pretty forgettable, not necessarily bad, but it's nowhere near the same level as the Whims of Fate or Gentle Madman, or even the Depths of Memento's theme, which I like despite it being pretty simple. I do enjoy the idea of a medieval castle as a palace, but it doesn't feel like Kamoshida's palace uses its concept as well as it could have. I also really like the Kamoshida fight. He's a great first boss and has a good degree of challenge. Plus his design is really striking and the huge volleyball attack is a great surprise to catch players off guard. That being said though, Kamoshida's palace is ultimately weighed down by the mediocre music, aesthetic, and enemies, leaving it in a more decent spot as opposed to an amazing spot. Next up at number 8 we have Okumura's palace. Let me start off by saying I don't despise Okumura's quite as much as a lot of other people seem to, but still to say I really like it wouldn't be accurate. Its music isn't too bad, it's a bit basic but it works well enough, but the enemies are a bit of a problem. Not in terms of difficulty though. In fact, I think the tougher enemies balance out the free damage and baton passes that Dekarabias and Mothmen give you by being weak to physical and gun quite well. There are 2 problems though. One is that the savage enemy, the Giri Mikala, is really hard but for the wrong reasons. I usually like tough enemies who keep you on your toes in palaces, but this one annoys me because he doesn't just do a lot of damage and isn't just extremely tanky. He also inflicts you with rage, which, when it works, can cause Joker to attack him when he repels physical, and this combined with the extra damage you take while enraged kills you without fail. At least that's my experience. That may not seem too unfair, it's a smart move on the enemy's part and using elements in itself isn't unfair, but under certain circumstances which don't seem too hard to have since it's happened to me several times in multiple playthroughs, you can't do anything about it unless Detox activates, which is luck based. Not only is that extremely dumb to me, but it's also a massive difficulty spike compared to even the tougher enemies in this palace. And then the other problem is that to me, the enemies feel too repetitive. What I mean is, there seem to be really long stretches of time where I'm fighting the same 4 enemies, then the next area changes up 2 of them. This plus the somewhat boring level design, both gameplay wise and aesthetic wise, results in the whole thing feeling like a slog at times. And then there's the boss fight. The combination of Okumura's BS ailments, buffs and debuffs, plus the robots resisting everything barring gun and their weaknesses, is extremely aggravating. All these things, when combined with the massive difficulty difficulty spike between the rest of the palace and this boss make it immensely painful and far more difficult than it should be. So not only does Okumura's palace have a fair few problems, but it's also dragged down a ton by its almost unanimously hated boss fight, bringing it to the number 8 spot. And finally, at the number 9 spot, the worst palace in Persona 5 Royal, for me, is Madarame's. Now, I know what you're thinking. How in the hell can Madarame's palace be worse than Okumura's? To make this quick, Madarame's palace is simply not as interesting as any of the others. The palace theme is by far the worst in the game, even when compared to Okumura's. The enemies are the most forgettable in the game as well, and lack any substantial challenge, except for the Willseed boss. And while the palace theme does reflect Madarame's cognition, the bland golden color palette gets very boring after a while. But that's just the summary. If you want to hear my full analysis on why I hate Madarame's palace, watch this video now.